My dear friends, as I promised you 2 weeks ago, when I introduced the ideas of humanism as something that humanity has been struggling to reestablish through many forms of exploitation until they get to the point where the human nature is one of cooperation, helping one another, living together, and not dominating one with the other, and a state structure that reflects that kind of human relationship. I promised also that I would talk today about contributions to humanism from Karl Marx, because there has been the conception that Karl Marx established a particular line of social attitude or social direction which falls into humanism, as though humanism might be interpreted as coming from his works. I wanted to make it clear that Marx's work is a contribution to the struggle for humanism. And he did some special analyses with regards to how the battle to achieve humanism develops during the society called capitalism, where there is a specific form of exploitation that differs from that of slavery and serfdom. It is a form called wage labor. And at the rate that things are going at the present time, with workers losing their jobs, and 1 out of 10 in the country will not know for a number of years what jobs they are going to have, there is a development of actually a wage slavery that is taking place around the world and increasing poverty. So Marx's contribution is very important to understand, because what he added to understanding this struggle to reach a human development that corresponds to the relative tranquility of tribal communism is a scientific approach. He developed a science of society. That science was based upon a number of observations. These observations came about first, I might say these observations came about because the nature of exploitation under capitalism is not as obvious as the nature of exploitation of a slave or a serf. A slave is totally bound. A serf is bound to the land. And when you change that relationship with those who control the slave and the serf, it's a very simple, almost an arithmetic count. But when you deal with wage labor, how does this exploitation take place? And Marx follows a number of movements for a change in the attitude of government. The attitude of government when capitalism arose was to establish a central government with a parliamentary procedure, and the voters would supposedly have a voice in the government. But it just so happens that the capitalism, when it first developed in the 17th and in the 19th century and the latter part of the 17th century, especially in the 19th century, that capitalism did not have votes for workers. It did not have votes for many religious people who were workers, either on the farms or in the factories. And movements developed to tell the government how to include people. And one of the movements, as I indicated, was the socialism that developed out of religion, and the socialism that developed out of the Chartist movement, which was a combination of religious people and working people. And the working people were very much molested by the British government. as I told you a couple of weeks ago, because they already represented a class structure, and obvious in their demands. And then their first demands were the right to vote, to take it just in the beginning, and they all called it socialism. Now, Marx came into the picture in 1848. The charters, incidentally, came into the picture in 1836. Many of them were put in jail, and they suffered considerably. Now, Marx was asked by the European working people to write them a manifesto of their rights and the situation in society which would develop and which would take into consideration the rights of working people. And the interesting thing about the manifesto which Marx and Engels wrote is that they didn't call it the Socialist Manifesto. They called it the Communist Manifesto. That's quite an interesting point, because they linked the idea of socialism, which is a transition period from the capitalism into a higher order which relates to the communism of tribal communism. In other words, to collective ownership and the collectivity of society as a whole. So he called it the Communist Manifesto. But it's very interesting that the opening of the Communist Manifesto made reference to the transition of humanism before that period. And that covered societies which were based upon slavery and serfdom. And so he said, including capitalism, that the history of all hitherto existing societies has been a history of class struggle. In saying that, he linked himself with those who objected, or those who were being exploited in those societies, which were, as I indicated before, slavery, serfdom, and the working class. And he also said that when capitalism came into being, which exploits through the working class, that capitalism did a very important job of creating industry, of creating a new form of the use of the forces of nature, where they could set up factories that create things that people use, or methods of cultivation and husbandry which could not exist by nature itself. Capitalism brought much of that into being as a method of making money by capitalizing the ownership of these forces of production, so that when they wanted workers, they had to free the serfs off the land. And when they freed the serfs off the land in the Enclosure Acts, the serfs became individuals. And as individuals, they had individual movement. With individual movement, they could go to a factory, and then they could sell their ability to work for a wage. And everybody knows, and Marx first established it, that the wage is much less than the value of the commodities that are produced using that form of wage labor in the industrial form of economic development and production. So capitalism is characterized as a society which is based upon wage labor and industry, and the relationship between wage labor and the owners and controllers of industry, which ultimately develops into the wage laborers and the finance capitalists who control the movement of industry, the movement of money, and they're the ones who determine which way the social relations go.